Some movies entertain you, a few disturb you, but the 15 films on this list did something almost nobody attempted. They went too far on purpose. They showed you things cinema is not supposed to show, broke rules nobody thought could be broken, and left audiences sitting in silence, not because they were bored, but because they genuinely did not know what they had just watched. And here's the thing. These are not your typical science fiction films. In fact, every entry on this list pushed creative boundaries so far that logic itself stopped applying. Most of them you have never seen, and a few you may wish you could unsee. So before the algorithm pulls you somewhere safer, stay here till the end, because the #1 film on this list is not a movie you watch. It is something you endure. Let's begin. Number 15. Possessor, 2020. Brandon Cronenberg spent 8 years developing this film, not because the story was too complex to crack, but because no studio in their right mind wanted to fund what he was describing. A corporate assassination thriller where the violence was not the point, but the complete psychological destruction of identity was. When the project finally came together, it was produced through Rhombus Media and Rook Films on a tight independent budget, the kind of money Hollywood drops on catering for a single blockbuster. Principal photography began in April 2019 in Ontario, Canada, and wrapped just 5 weeks later in May. The cast tells you everything about the kind of project this was. Andrea Riseborough signed on as the lead. She plays the role of a woman who hijacks other people's bodies through brain implant technology to carry out corporate assassinations. Christopher Abbott played her target. Sean Bean and Jennifer Jason Leigh rounded out the ensemble. None of them were there for a paycheck. Leigh had already starred in his father David Cronenberg's Existence back in 1999, and her presence created an almost genetic link between father and son. What made this film infamous was the practical effects. Brandon Cronenberg refused to lean on CGI. He brought in Dan Martin, the special makeup effects artist known for work on the Human Centipede franchise, and together they built physical prosthetics, puppets, and wax replicas of the actors. The hallucination sequences were shot entirely in camera, using projection feedback techniques that Cronenberg and his cinematographer Karim Hussein had spent years experimenting with in Hussein's living room. They literally built a wax replica of Andrea Riseborough's head and melted it on the final day of shooting. That image is not a computer effect. It is real wax collapsing in real time on camera. Possessor opened to roughly $227,000 and finished its entire theatrical run with under $911,000 worldwide. That number was extremely disappointing. Number 14. Under the Skin, 2013. Jonathan Glazer started developing Under the Skin after finishing his debut film Sexy Beast in 2000. The original concept was elaborate and effects-heavy, adapted from Michelle Faber's 2000 novel about an alien predator disguised as a woman hunting men across the Scottish Highlands. Glazer and co-writer Walter Campbell stripped all of that away over the years until what remained was barely recognizable as a conventional film at all. By the time cameras rolled, the script was almost non-existent. The budget landed around $13.3 million. Gemma Arterton was originally Glazer's first choice for the lead, but the project needed a bigger star to secure financing. Scarlett Johansson came aboard in early 2010 and remained committed for 4 years before a single frame was shot. She was the only professional actor in nearly the entire film. Everyone else was real. Civilians. People pulled off the streets of Glasgow who had no idea they were being filmed. Glazer's production method was unlike anything attempted in narrative filmmaking at that scale. A visual effects studio called One of Us built a custom camera dubbed the One Cam, roughly the size of a matchbox, capable of fitting 16mm lenses and producing feature-quality images. The crew installed around 10 of these miniature cameras in locations across Glasgow. Hidden inside buckets, umbrellas, pieces of luggage, and above shop fronts. 8 more cameras were rigged inside the white van Johansson drove through the city, while the director and a skeleton crew hid in the back. The nightclub scene, the shopping center sequences, every interaction where Johansson lures men into her van were entirely unscripted, filmed in secret with real people who genuinely did not know a camera existed. Despite all these, when Under the Skin premiered, the audience booed. Festival artistic director Alberto Barbera later recalled it as one of the worst screening reactions he had ever witnessed. Theatrically, Under the Skin was a disaster, grossing roughly $7.2 million worldwide against its $13.3 million budget. Number 13. Annihilation, 2018. This film caused a war inside its own studio before most audiences ever saw it. Alex Garland was hired in late 2014 to adapt Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy for Paramount Pictures. The budget settled around $55 million. Natalie Portman led the cast alongside Jennifer Jason Leigh, Tessa Thompson, Gina Rodriguez, Tuva Novotny, and Oscar Isaac. On paper, this should have been a prestige science fiction event. Behind the scenes, it became one of the ugliest producer clashes in recent Hollywood memory. It all began with the test screenings that summer. The results were poor. David Ellison, head of Skydance Productions and a major co-financier of Paramount's slate, became alarmed. He believed the film was too intellectual and too complicated for mainstream audiences. Ellison demanded changes. He wanted Portman's character made more sympathetic. He wanted the ending altered. But the film's executive producer Scott Rudin had final cut approval. Rudin sided with Garland and refused to implement a single note. The two producers went to war, with Paramount caught in the middle. The studio's solution was unprecedented. Rather than risk a full worldwide theatrical release on a film its own financier had lost faith in, Paramount struck a deal with Netflix. The streaming service would handle all international distribution. Annihilation debuted with roughly $11 million from just over 2,000 theaters. Its total domestic run ended at $32.7 million. Number 12. Beyond the Black Rainbow, 2010. Panos Cosmatos paid for this film with the ghost of his father. That is not a metaphor. When his father, George, died in 2005, the DVD residuals from Tombstone kept arriving. Panos took that money, roughly $1 million, and poured every cent of it into one of the strangest science fiction films ever committed to celluloid. He was not trying to make a career move. He was trying to survive. Panos spiraled into what he later described as a slow-motion mode of self-destruction and binge drinking. And the film that came out of that process was Beyond the Black Rainbow. Behind the scenes, cinematographer Norm Lee insisted on shooting with analog film instead of digital cameras because the references Cosmatos kept citing, movies from the late 1970s and early 1980s, were all grainy, colorful, and full of texture. The film is set in an alternate 1983 inside a research facility called the Arborea Institute, where a drugged and mute young woman with psychic abilities is held captive by a deteriorating scientist. There is almost no dialogue. The pacing is deliberately suffocating. One key flashback sequence depicting a nightmarish acid trip was directly inspired by the visual style of Begotten. Cosmatos shot that sequence in high-contrast black and white to make it feel like a decaying artifact from another dimension. When Beyond the Black Rainbow premiered at the 2010 Whistler Film Festival, almost nobody saw it. It screened at Tribeca, Fantastic Fest, and Fantasia over the following year, building a microscopic but fiercely devoted following. The box office reports were negligible. Number 11. The Fly, 1986. In 1986, David Cronenberg made a body horror movie about a scientist dissolving into an insect, and audiences walked out shaken in ways they could not fully articulate. The producer wanted Pierce Brosnan, the studio wanted John Malkovich. Richard Dreyfuss and Michael Keaton were both considered. David Cronenberg wanted Jeff Goldblum. Not because Goldblum was the most bankable name on that list, but because Goldblum was the only actor willing to spend 5 hours a day in a makeup chair, being buried alive under layers of foam latex prosthetics, while still delivering a performance that would break your heart. That willingness is the reason The Fly exists as anything more than a creature feature. The budget was around $15 million. During production, visual artist Chris Walas was brought on to handle what would become one of the most ambitious practical transformation sequences in film history. The evolution of Seth Brundle into the creature audiences would come to call Brundlefly was broken into 7 distinct stages, each requiring increasingly elaborate prosthetics. In the early stages, Goldblum wore subtle facial appliances with rash-like discoloration and tiny fly hairs emerging from his skin. By the later stages, he was encased in full-body foam latex suits, his entire frame rebuilt with prosthetic teeth, bald patches, and deformed limbs. One entire stage of the transformation, known as Stage 4B, was filmed but cut from the final movie. It only survived in the trailer. When The Fly opened, it grossed $60.6 million against its budget, making it the biggest commercial hit of Cronenberg's entire career. Number 10. Tetsuo, the Iron Man, 1989. Shinya Tsukamoto funded this film with pocket change from his day job. There is no confirmed production budget because there was barely any production at all. He wrote the script, he directed it, he produced it, he edited it. He served as cinematographer alongside his co-star Kei Fujiwara, who also doubled as the film's other camera operator. Fujiwara's apartment was used as both the filming location and the production headquarters. The entire cast consisted of 6 people. The camera was 16 millimeters. The film stock was black and white. The running time was 67 minutes. And somehow, out of those conditions, one of the most viscerally aggressive science fiction films in cinema history clawed its way into existence. Filming stretched across 18 months, and the process nearly killed the project. The cramped conditions, the relentless intensity of the material, and the physical demands of shooting stop-motion body horror sequences in a tiny apartment wore down the crew until almost everyone quit. Fujiwara herself left before the production was finished due to creative disagreements with Tsukamoto. By the end, only Taguchi remained. Tsukamoto later admitted he considered burning the negative entirely, but he did not. Instead, he finished editing in January 1989 and booked the premiere at Nakano Musashino Hall in Tokyo. While designing the promotional poster, he approached Japanese film critic Yoichi Komatsuzawa for a quote. Komatsuzawa did something far more valuable. He submitted the film to the Fanta Festival in Rome, where Komatsuzawa served as their Asian film correspondent. Tetsuo won Best Film at the festival. Number 9. Videodrome, 1983. David Cronenberg predicted the internet in 1983. He did not call it the internet, he called it Videodrome, a pirate broadcast signal that rewires the human brain through prolonged exposure to violent imagery. 40 years later, the film reads less like science fiction and more like a documentary about what screens have actually done to us. And here's the thing. Videodrome was Cronenberg's first film backed by a major Hollywood studio. Universal Pictures came on board, giving him roughly 5.9 million Canadian dollars. Behind the scenes, the production was a constant battle between vision and budget. Rick Baker's special effects team was working with a $500,000 effects budget, and additional cuts were made when that budget simply could not allow certain scenes to be realized. The script itself kept changing. Throughout the shoot, Cronenberg wrote new scenes and rewrote old ones, distributing new pages to crew members regularly. In fact, the writing of Videodrome continued until the very last day of shooting. One of the film's most iconic effects, a television screen that bulges outward as if breathing, was achieved using a video projector and a sheet of dental dam stretched across the frame. Baker originally tested the effect with a weather balloon, but it did not stretch far enough. The dental dam turned out to be flexible enough to create the illusion of a living screen. 3 different endings were shot for this movie. The finale used in the film, where Max shoots himself while whispering, "Long live the new flesh," was conceived by James Woods himself. Cronenberg had planned an additional epilogue that would have revealed other characters possessing their own body mutations. But the scene was never filmed. The budget ran out. When Videodrome opened, it grossed just over $1 million and finished its entire run at roughly $2.1 million. Number 8. Naked Lunch, 1991. William Burroughs shot and killed his common-law wife Joan Vollmer during a drunken game of William Tell at a party in Mexico City in 1951. He placed a glass on her head and fired. He missed the glass. Burroughs was convicted in absentia of homicide and received a 2-year suspended sentence before fleeing to the United States. He would later write that he was forced to the appalling conclusion that he would never have become a writer but for Joan's death. That confession sits at the center of everything David Cronenberg built around Naked Lunch. The budget landed around $18 million. And here's the thing. The novel itself was considered unfilmable for decades. It was not a narrative in any conventional sense, but a hallucinatory collage of addiction, paranoia, and grotesque fantasy that had no beginning, no middle, and no end. On set, Peter Weller played Burroughs' surrogate Bill Lee with a deadpan precision that felt chemically correct. Judy Davis played two versions of the same woman. Roy Scheider appeared as the sinister Dr. Binway. The creatures, the typewriters that turned into insects, the grotesque mugwumps of Interzone. These were realized through practical effects that cost real money and delivered real revulsion. When Naked Lunch opened, it earned just $2.6 million. Number 7. Strange Days, 1995. James Cameron started writing this story around 1985. He wrote it with Kathryn Bigelow in mind to direct. At the time, Cameron and Bigelow were married. By the time the film reached theaters a decade later, their marriage was over. But the movie survived. Strange Days imagines a black market device called Squid that records human experiences directly from the wearer's brain, allowing anyone to replay the memories, sensations, and emotions of another person. The production budget was $42 million. Before production, Cameron wrote a 90-page treatment that he described as practically a novel, then brought in screenwriter Jay Cox to turn it into a structured script. Cameron did a final dialogue polish on top. Bigelow considered it her most personal film, calling it a synthesis of every creative track she had been exploring since she started making art. No existing camera system could achieve the point-of-view shots the Squid sequences required, so the research division of Cameron's company Lightstorm Entertainment spent a full year designing and fabricating a custom 35mm camera. It weighed just 8 pounds, fit in the palm of a hand, and featured interchangeable lenses with remote follow focus. The camera was mounted on a Steadicam-style rig that mimicked the movement and stability of the human eye. To shoot the film's legendary opening sequence, 5 crew members were stacked on top of each other in the trunk of a car, operating the equipment and providing additional on-camera hands. On opening weekend, Strange Days grossed just $31,000. It finished its entire theatrical run with roughly $8 million worldwide. It was a catastrophic financial failure. Number 6. Stalker, 1979. Andrei Tarkovsky began production on Stalker by shooting all the outdoor sequences over the course of an entire year. When the crew returned to Moscow with the footage, they discovered it was unusable. The film had been shot on Kodak 5-247 stock, and Soviet processing laboratories were not familiar with the material. Every frame was ruined. Tarkovsky was devastated. He fired his first cinematographer, Georgy Rurberg, immediately. He then convinced the Soviet Film Board that he was making a 2-part film, which allowed him to secure additional funding and new deadlines. He hired a new cinematographer, Alexander Knyazhinsky, and went back to Estonia to reshoot the entire movie from scratch. During the course of this second production, Tarkovsky suffered a heart attack, but he kept working. Behind the scenes, the location itself was the problem nobody fully understood at the time. Upstream from the hydroelectric stations sat a chemical plant that was dumping toxic waste into the river. Sound designer Vladimir Sharoun recalled the conditions plainly. In fact, there was a shot in the film showing snow falling in summer and white foam floating down the water. Those were not weather effects, they were poison. The cast and crew were sloshing through contaminated water for months. Women on the crew developed allergic reactions on their faces and bodies. Despite all these, nobody stopped filming. But here's the thing, the film's most devastating legacy came later. Within a decade of its release, both Tarkovsky and lead actor Anatoly Solzhenitsyn had died of lung cancer. In 1998, Tarkovsky's wife and assistant director, Larissa Tarkovskaya, passed away from the same illness. They are said to have been exposed to toxic chemicals at the locations used for filming. Number 5. Mandy, 2018. Nicolas Cage hired a screaming coach to prepare for this film. Due to his character's vengeful rage, Nicolas Cage was required to scream a lot for his lead performance in Mandy. In order to get those screams just right, Cage worked with a screaming coach named David Sellers. That detail, absurd on its surface, is actually the key to everything Mandy is. The budget was $6 million. Behind the scenes, the forest sequences were shot in the High Fens region of Belgium. The cabin where Red and Mandy live was built by the crew on the site of an abandoned Boy Scout pavilion. The lairs of the film's antagonists were constructed inside an abandoned house outside of Chaudfontaine. The The production shot on ARRI Alexa cameras in Panavision anamorphic format with film grain added in post-production to achieve the weathered, analog texture Cosmatos wanted. The film's most iconic prop, the battle axe Red forges for his revenge, designed after the F from the logo of Swiss extreme metal band Celtic Frost. The opening credits play over Starless by King Crimson, taken from their 1974 album Red, which is also the name of Cage's character. The chainsaw duel was filmed in a quarry outside of Beverse in a single night. Cosmatos later described the shoot as nightmarish. And just before shooting began, Cage's 14-year marriage to Alice Kim ended unexpectedly. In a Guardian interview, Cage admitted the collapse was a shock he did not see coming, and that the resulting emotions went directly into his performance. Mandy premiered and grossed roughly $1.7 million. Number 4. Jacob's Ladder, 1990. Bruce Joel Rubin wrote this screenplay because of a nightmare he had about being trapped in a New York City subway station. He spent a year turning that dream into a script, then spent nearly a decade trying to get anyone in Hollywood to make it. Nobody wanted it. Universal Pictures said they loved it, but it was not for their studio. The problem was simple. You could not pitch the film's ending without giving away the entire experience, and no executive wanted to invest in a story they could not explain in a sentence. Jacob's Ladder was produced on a budget of $25 million. Lynn's visual approach was ferocious. Every special effect in the film was achieved practically, with no post-production manipulation. The famous head-shaking effect, where a figure vibrates its skull at an impossible speed, was created by filming the actor moving his head at an extremely low frame rate of 4 frames per second, then playing it back at normal speed. The result was a movement so fast and inhuman that audiences could not process what they were seeing. Lynn cited the paintings of Francis Bacon as his inspiration for the technique. The original screenplay used traditional imagery of demons and hellfire. Jacob's Ladder opened, grossing $7.5 million in its opening weekend and finishing with $26.1 million domestically. Number 3. The Holy Mountain, 1973. John Lennon used to show up at the Elgin Theater in New York City late at night, smoke a joint in the dark, and watch Alejandro Jodorowsky's El Topo on a loop. One day, he and Yoko Ono approached Jodorowsky about financing his next film. The amount they offered was reportedly around $1 million. They also encouraged Lennon's manager, Alan Klein of ABK-CO Music and Records, to produce the project. Klein agreed. Jodorowsky was given total creative freedom and a budget of $750,000 to make whatever he wanted. What he delivered was The Holy Mountain, a film so extreme that its own financier eventually locked the prince away for over 30 years. And here's the thing. Before cameras rolled, Jodorowsky and his wife spent an entire week without sleep under the guidance of a Japanese Zen master. The central cast then spent 3 months doing spiritual exercises. After the training, the entire group lived communally in Jodorowsky's home for a month before production began. Filming started in early 1972 and was shot entirely in Mexico, on a schedule that followed the story's own sequence. Jodorowsky was also instructed by Ichazo to take LSD during the process. He administered psilocybin mushrooms to the actors during the death-rebirth sequence. This was not a controlled set. This was a ritual. The soundtrack was composed by Jodorowsky himself alongside arranger Ron Frangipane and jazz trumpeter Don Cherry. The Holy Mountain premiered at the 1973 Cannes Film Festival and caused immediate controversy and fascination in equal measure. Number 2. Possession, 1981. Andrzej Zulawski wrote this screenplay during the most painful period of his life. His marriage to Polish actress Małgorzata Bronek was collapsing, and the script that emerged from that destruction was not a metaphor for divorce. It was divorce itself, externalized into body horror, espionage, and a tentacled creature built by Carlo Rambaldi. That combination of domestic devastation and physical monstrosity is why Possession has never been replicated. No one else has been angry enough or precise enough to fuse those two things so completely. The film was shot in West Berlin in 1980. The setting was not incidental. The subway scene was filmed at 5 in the morning at the Platz der Luftbrücke U-Bahn station in Berlin, after the trains had stopped running. There were 2 takes. Zulawski later explained that he knew the scene demanded enormous emotional and physical effort from Ajani, and the cold conditions in the tunnel made it unthinkable to shoot it repeatedly. Most of what appears in the finished film is the first take. In the sequence, Anna collapses, screams, thrashes against a stone wall, smashes grocery bags until liquid pours across the floor, and writhes in a full-body convulsion that appears to depict a supernatural miscarriage. The performance is so physically extreme that it transcends acting. Ajani later said it took her several years to emotionally recover from the role. Zulawski confirmed that she attempted to harm herself after filming was completed. When Possession opened, it totaled just $1.1 million in the United States. Ajani won Best Actress at both the Cannes Film Festival and the César Awards for the role. Number 1. Begotten, 1990. Elias Merhige was 20 years old when he wrote this film. He owned a small theater production company in New York City and had been developing experimental stage work for years. His original vision for Begotten was a dance theater piece with live music to be performed at Lincoln Center. When he learned the production would cost $250,000, he abandoned the stage and decided to make a film instead. That decision produced 72 minutes of footage that has haunted everyone who has seen it for over 3 decades. Begotten was made on an estimated budget of $33,000. Behind the scenes, Merhige spent 8 months building an optical printer from scratch, using spare parts from camera stores and special effects houses where he had previously worked. Each minute of footage generated by that printer took between 8 and 10 hours of labor on his part. The post-production process alone took 3 entire years. He was constructing the visual language of the film molecule by molecule, stripping the footage of its midtones until only the harshest contrasts of black and white remained, making the images look like documents from before human memory began. Merhige described his intention as, "I looked not to film history, but to the way rock erodes over millennia, to the pitted surfaces of ancient ruins that speak to something far beyond human memory. I wanted to make a documentary of what existed before the world began." But here's the thing. Begotten did not receive a theatrical distribution deal. Distributors told Merhige that if he could screen it for free in a high school basement in the Bronx, he would be lucky. The film played at the San Francisco International Film Festival in 1990, where it was passed along to critic and writer Susan Sontag. If any of this film's messed with your head in the best way possible, let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next list goes even deeper.